Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the National Research Mentoring Network's Career Development Webinar, Transitioning to Research Independence, Funding and Grantsmanship. Today we have Dr. Jaime Rubin from Columbia University Medical School presenting a more in-depth guide to transitioning to research independence. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and then placed on the NRMN YouTube channel in the upcoming weeks. Dr. Rubin has graciously agreed to share the slide deck after the presentation upon request, so please do send an email to me if you're interested in obtaining that material. We have allotted for about a 30-minute Q&A portion at the end of the presentation, so if you would please direct your questions to the Q&A chat box, and we will address them accordingly at the end when it's appropriate in the Q&A portion. So thank you so much, Dr. Rubin, for joining us today and sharing your wonderful expertise. I know this community is very excited to hear this, this content. So without any further ado, Dr. Rubin.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I just want to start by just highlighting a new notice that NIH had just issued with regard to their statement on their interest in increasing the diversity of the biomedical workforce. It was just issued just a couple of weeks ago, and just to highlight a couple of statements in this new notice. NIH's ability to ensure that the nation remains a global leader in scientific discovery and innovation is dependent upon a pool of highly talented scientists from diverse backgrounds who will help further NIH's mission. Research shows that diverse teams working together and capitalizing on innovative ideas and distinct perspectives outperform homogeneous teams. Scientists and trainees from diverse backgrounds and life experiences bring different perspectives, creativity, and individual enterprise to address complex scientific problems. They basically have 3 to 4 different categories of what they would consider underrepresented populations in biomedical research in this country. You can see the list there. They do note that it's recognized that underrepresentation can vary from setting to setting. Individuals from racial or ethnic groups that can be demonstrated convincingly to be underrepresented by the grantee institution should be encouraged to participate in NIH programs to enhance diversity. These are the different categories that they have. And also women are included in terms of programs to address faculty recruitment, appointment, retention, and advancement. This new notice differs from their previous statements on diversity in that they're expanding the definition of individuals from a disadvantaged background. So I encourage anybody who feels that they meet any of these categories to look into these notices and the diversity programs, and I have the URL printed on the screen so you can see a list of all of their programs. So this is an outline of the topics that I'm going to discuss today, and it also is to remind me to tell you that any good grant application should also start with an outline. It helps ensure that you cover everything that you want to cover and everything is presented in an organized and structured way. So we're going to start by discussing government agencies as sources of funding. Now, I'm going to focus, of course, on NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, because that's the single largest source of government funding for biomedical research in the country, but just to tell you that there are lots of other federal agencies that also support biomedical research. So for instance, the Department of Agriculture funds research in nutrition. Environmental Protection Agency funds research in the biological effects of radiation. So and the Department of Defense has a very large medical research program also. So don't only focus on the NIH, there might be other federal programs, funding agencies that are suitable for your research interests. Now, with regard to NIH, you know, there's an S at the end of institutes. It's the National Institutes of Health, and most of them focus on different disease areas. So for instance, the National Cancer Institute or the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases. And these are the entities that would support the research, that would, in a way, send money to your institution to support your career development or your research. I put a circle around the box at the bottom, which is the Center for Scientific Review, to remind me to tell you that in many cases, and we'll go through the details, your grant is not reviewed at the Institute, it's reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review, while it might be funded by the Institute. So also to remind me to tell you that it's important to understand the review process at NIH or other funding agencies to make sure that your grant goes to the right place and is reviewed by the right panel, and you write the grant accordingly to get the fairest and the most informed review by the reviewers. This is sort of what a typical institute looks like. There's an intramural component, so there is a building for the National Cancer Institute where one can go and work for a career or for a short period of time as a postdoc or as a junior faculty member or as a student. But the focus of today's talk is on the left-hand side of the screen, where we're going to discuss the extramural component of the Institute. And this is where the Institute supports extramural programs across the country at institutions, academic and other research institutions across the country. And three main forms of extramural funding mechanisms: grants, cooperative agreements, and contracts. Just a quick overview of the NIH budget. It's increasing every year. The red is the total funding to NIH, and the green is the extramural component, the part that goes out to institutions all across the country. And this gives you an idea of their budget. How is the pie, if you will, of their budget split up into their different areas of funding. So that the light blue is the intramural component that I mentioned. The dark blue is for research grants, the investigator-initiated research grants that we're going to talk about today. The dark green, the olive green, if you will, is funding for research training, which we're going to talk on today, fellowships, career development, and so forth. So moving along, what are the different types of funding mechanisms and what do they fund? So this sort of gives you a very sort of broad overview, and I'm going to touch on many of these, of the different types of grants, if you will, that NIH offers for different points in your career and for different purposes. The main goal as an academic scientist, though, is to get an NIH research grant, a so-called investigator-initiated research grant that will support your research program, or even better, to have more than one of these. And to realize that not all grants are the same. The grants have different missions. So for instance, that first bullet there, fellowships and training grants support students and postdoctoral fellows. Career development grants usually support either very senior postdocs or beginning assistant professors. We can have a research project an R grant that supports an individual research project, or so-called P grants that support multiple projects. They provide different types of funding. So for instance, a research grant provides for salary, fellowships provide for stipends. There are small research grants that just provide funding for pilot awards to allow you to generate preliminary data, or there are research grants that provide for the comprehensive costs of the research project. The training grants, the fellowships, the fellowships and the career development grants are not renewable. You get them for 5 years or 3 years for the fellowships. But the neat thing about an NIH research grant is that they are renewable. You might get them for an initial 4 or 5 years and then submit a competitive renewal. So what kind of grants are we talking about across your career pathway? So in graduate school, you might have had an individual fellowship, you might have been supported by a training grant, you might have been supported by your mentor's research grant. Similar sort of funding when you were a postdoctoral fellow. And sorry, went a little too quickly. A new type of award is the Career Transition Award that helps individuals make the transition from their senior postdoc stage through this very vulnerable period to being an assistant professor or instructor. Similarly, those of you that are clinically trained, you might have done research one summer in medical school, or you're an MD or PhD trained, you were on a training grant, or you took a year, an enhancement year to do research, might have done research while you were an intern or a resident. Similarly, had some research years while you were a clinical fellow, and are now also making that transition from senior fellow to beginning assistant professor, beginning faculty position. Well, NIH has an award program specifically for this transition stage. It's called the K99R00, or Pathway to Independent Award. And you see Pathway to Independence, the PI award. And these are for individuals that have no more than 4 years of research experience after their doctoral degree, no more of 4 years of research experience, let's say postdoctoral experience, and don't have an R01. And there are two main components of this funding program. The K award when you're a senior postdoc, if you will, 1 to 2 years, need to dedicate 75% of your time to the activities, the research and career development activities described in the K award. And then 3 years as of a research award, which they call the R00, which you could take with you when you get a faculty position. And so this is a beginning research grant as you begin to get your independent research program up and going. Individuals that hold the K99R00 award, generally speaking, the institutions that are seeking to recruit junior faculty look for individuals with this type of award, because it demonstrates that they've already gone through this very competitive NIH process, and successfully so, having been awarded this very competitive grant mechanism. And this gives you an idea of the K99, the number of awards over time. It's only about 10 years old, so it's this sort of yellowish color of the number of K99s across NIH. You can see that it just started in 2007, and then it's increased over time until we are at a very significant number, and I hope it increases as we go forward. And in terms of the success rate, this is an example of the K99 success rate and number of awards from heart, lung, and blood in the last fiscal year for which there's data. So for example, they received 113 applications. They made 28 awards for a success rate of about 25%. And so the idea is that one will eventually get an independent research grant, or R01 in NIH speak, if you will, going from postdoc fellowship, getting a faculty position, so K99 R00, and then getting an R01. I'm then going to move along to what's the next type of award as a junior faculty. And these are called the Mentored Career Development, or K awards, which one would get as an assistant professor or instructor. And similarly, for those that are clinically trained, the same types of K awards are also available. The main types of K awards I'm going to go through, but generally one needs to dedicate 75% of your time to the research and career development activities described in the application. They're usually awarded for 5 years. There is a citizenship permanent residency requirement. And if you were to get your own research grant or RO1, in the last 2 years, you can reduce your effort from 75 to 50%. So different types of K awards. There's the KO1, which different institutes use it for different purposes. And I've listed a few of them here. And to just give a little more specifics with regard to different institutes. So the National Institutes of Mental Health uses the KO1 to fund individuals researching a broad spectrum of basic and translational research. The Neurologic Institute, Neurologic Diseases and Stroke Institute funds senior postdoctoral investigators with the KO1. Similarly, the Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Disease Institute. And now some institutes use it to support individuals funding in specific areas. So allergy and infectious disease supports individuals in epidemiology and data science. Similarly, the National Library of Medicine. The Fogarty Institute supports individuals that are interested in international or global health research. The Genome Research Institute, Heart, Lung, and Blood, and the National Cancer Institute, the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, the Dental Institute, and the Neurological Diseases and Stroke Institute to increase faculty diversity. So they will fund individuals, junior faculty, specifically to increase the diversity of the biomedical workforce. So if anybody meets these criteria, I would encourage you to apply to this funding mechanism. For those of you that are clinically trained, there's two main types of K awards. There's the K08 for basic or translational or bench research, and the K23, which is more for patient-oriented research. Now, the applications for all of these programs is exactly the same. The review criteria is basically the same. And there's even a K25 program for individuals that have a non-biological or biomedical background, and to bring these individuals into the biomedical workforce. So those that have a quantitative background, let's say in computer science or informatics, chemistry, and for them to have a protected time to learn biomedical research. These are the funding announcements, if you will, the K01, the K08, the K23, and the K99R00. Success rate, here's another example, heart, lung, and blood of the K23. And the success rate here in the last year for which data is available, 2018, the success rate was about 37%. That's a very good success rate when compared to research grants. In terms of the number of awards over time, the K01, the K08, and the K23. And so what are some of the take-home messages here? If you look at the K01, which is the darkest blue, look at 1997, it was sort of, at a very low number. And now if you go to 2018 at the far right, the numbers have increased significantly. The other message is the K23, which is for clinical research. Sizable numbers in 2018 did not exist in 1997 and about 20 years ago, showing the emphasis, now the increased emphasis on clinical research. And the different institutes use the K awards to different extents. As you can see, heart, lung, and blood, diabetes and digestive and kidney disease, the Cancer Institute, the Mental Health Institutes, but you would have your institute depending upon what your research areas are. And the whole point is for everybody to make the transition to having your own independent research grant. I'm going to mention briefly what the KL2 and the K12 are, but that is basically a training grant for junior faculty that's awarded to the institution. So this is a sort of a training grant that's awarded to the institution, and then the institution decides what junior faculty should be supported by their K-12 or KL2, which is basically the same thing. So one of the questions to ask as you begin to look for jobs is, do you have a K-12? Do you have a KL2? If so, would I be eligible to apply? That's one of the questions to ask as you begin to look for a job. So the grant mechanism. So as I've mentioned over and over again, the NIH R01, it supports a specific project. In the application, you would discuss specific aims. It should pay for, if you will, for all of the research, the comprehensive research. If you ask for up to $250,000 a year, you don't need to submit a detailed budget. As I mentioned, it's multi-year. There's some flexibility associated with it because it's a grant, as long as you're still addressing the same specific aims. So for example, started experiments using one strain of mice. Realized that a better strain of mice would be more appropriate. You could switch to the other strain of mice. And so what does it pay for? It pays for your salary as the principal investigator, the other research personnel, the students, the techs, any of the research costs, the reagents, the supplies, animal costs if you're using animals, patient care costs if you're doing clinical research, core facilities, travel to a national meeting to present your results. As I said, they're usually 4 to 5 years. And if you look at the last bullet, an example is, let's say you got it for 5 years, you renewed it twice for another 5 years each time, you've now had the grant for 15 years. And this is the success rate for research grants over time. And you can see much more competitive than the K awards we discussed previously, in the 20% range. The dark blue is the number of applications, the lighter blue is the number of awards, and the red is the success rate. And some smaller research grants, just to alert you to, there's the R03, which is $50,000 a year, usually for 2 years, with the point being that you would get an R03, generate preliminary data or pilot data, demonstrate feasibility, and then go in for using that data, go in with a much more competitive R01 grant. R21, same sort of idea, but a little bit more money, $275,000 over 2 years. Usually people will ask for $150,000 in the first year and $125,000 in the second year. People seem to think that it's easier to get an R21 than an R01 because it's less money and less time, and that's really not true. Just to give you this, show this graph of the success rate of R01 and R21s over time, and it's basically equivalent. There are some larger grants, these multi-project grants. So let's say the PO1, which is sort of 3 R01-like grants that tie together. So these are one of the questions to ask as you look for a job. Does your department or does your institute or does your center have a PO1 or any other multi-project grant in your area of research? First of all, it shows the research intensity of that academic unit in your area of interest. And also maybe the next time they go in for a competing renewal, you can join them and you could be the PI of one of the sections of that the PO1. A cooperative agreement is something that's sort of in the middle. You don't have as much flexibility as you do with a grant. NIH, in terms of the review process, they're looking for a network of awards. When they decide on the funding, not only do they use the usual NIH review criteria, which I'll touch on in a second, but there might be other considerations. They don't want all of the awards made into the Northeast or in California. They want the awards distributed across the country, or they want them in different research areas. They don't want more than one award, let's say in breast cancer. They want one of the awards, let's say in GI cancer, if you will. So there's other considerations than just the usual NIH review criteria. And then after the award is made, they are involved in the progress of the research during the year. This is a quote that I took from somebody's notice of grant award, that there's going to be substantial involvement by the NIH program officers during the course of the research. And finally, a contract, which has much less flexibility. And NIH determines with tremendous specificity what they would like done, what are the questions that are asked, how the questions will be answered. The application or proposal process is quite different, and the post-award process is quite different. But the take-home message here is there's much less flexibility. Some other different types of funding mechanisms, the administrative supplements that NIH uses to increase diversity. One of the ways to increase diversity in the biomedical workforce. So somebody has a research grant, let's say an R01, they can get extra money, additional money, a supplemental money from the NIH to hire a particular person that meets NIH's definition of increasing diversity. Or let's say somebody, that's the second bullet. With regard to the first bullet, let's say somebody interrupted their career for military service or for family responsibilities. They wanted to re-enter the biomedical workforce. If they found a mentor or a colleague or a collaborator with NIH funding, they can get additional money to support that individual as they re-enter the biomedical workforce. There is also this very large, what's called CTSA award, or Clinical and Translational Science Award. And it provides a lot of infrastructure at the institution for doing clinical and translational research. So this is one of the questions to ask as you look for a job. Does your institution have a CTSA? CTSA can provide pilot grants to allow you to generate pilot data. Or they have core facilities to run assays or to help you fill out the IRB and IRCOOK protocols. Many times they offer courses and workshops. Many of them also have this KL2 or K12 or training grants associated with it. In terms of training grants, I'll get to that in a second, maybe these can support their students and the postdocs that you hope to bring into your research group so that you don't have to pay for them. So another question to ask is, does your institution have a CTSA? Training grants. Training grants, many of you might have been supported or currently are supported by training grants. They can support the T32, can support pre-docs or postdocs, or both, or MD, PhD students, or T35 for those that are doing short-term research. And question to ask, does your institution have a T32 in your research area? Then the training grant could support the student or the postdoc who's working with you so that you don't have to pay for the student or the postdoc from your research grant or from your startup funds. It's also a measure of the research intensity at the academic unit that you're visiting. And one other example, suppose you wanted to buy a large piece of equipment. It's of course very tough to buy a large piece of equipment on a research grant. Well, NIH has a special program just for that, where a number of NIH-funded investigators come together and say, if we bought this piece of equipment, it could really move our research forward. So it gives you another idea of how NIH supports biomedical research. So what are the different types of funding announcements? And we sort of touched on that. Well, the different funding announcements can tell you a lot about the funding program. So there is the broadest, if you will, or the least specific funding announcement, which is called the parent PA or the parent program announcement. And they get much more specific until you get to the RFA or the request for application, where it is very specific about what NIH is asking for, what they want addressed. So one of the things to know about program announcements or the PAs is that there's no specific set aside of funds for that particular program. And the most general program announcements are called the parent program announcement. And here I've listed the 3 parent program announcements for the RO1. Ones where clinical trial is not allowed, clinical trial is required, and basic studies with human research subjects. The vast majority of folks apply to PA 19056, and certainly the basic scientists apply to this. And the parent announcement, there's no specificity at all with what type of research the NIH is looking for. It's the most generic, if you will. However, there are other program announcements that are a little bit more specific. So here's an example of a program announcement, still no set aside of money, issued by the National Institutes of Nursing Research as an example, where they're looking for RO1s in this area, maternal nutrition and pre-pregnancy obesity. So if this was your area of research and you were going to submit an RO1 application, you would respond specifically to this funding announcement. A few other flavors of program announcements is the PAR, where it's reviewed at the institute itself that's funding it. And in this case, it would be the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive Kidney Diseases, NIDDK. And they have a specifically an RO3, that's a small grant, if you remember, funding program for individuals that are the recipients of one of their K grants. And moving up that pyramid, if you will, is the RFA, or request for application, where there is a set aside of funds. And if you look in the announcement, it'll say something like, this institute has set aside, I'm going to make something up, $10 million to support, let's say, 30 grants in that area. And certainly if this is your area, you would respond to this RFA. And it's usually in a very well-defined scientific area with specific scientific questions that they want addressed in the grant application. So moving right along, as I said earlier, it's important to understand the grant review process at the funding agency, and in this case, the National Institutes of Health. So one of the first things to realize is NIH, and it's probably one of the few agencies that does, has 3 application cycles every year. Cycle 1, Cycle 2, and Cycle 3. The RO1 has its one deadline, the career development, K grants, and as an example, the RO3 and the R21 grants. So we just sort of went through the October deadline, if you will, for the RO1, the K, and the RO3 and the R21. Now these deadlines are for new applications. Let's say instead that you were submitting a renewal application, a competing renewal, or you were submitting a resubmission. You didn't get funded the first time, and so you're going to submit an amended application where you responded to the reviewer's comments. The deadline is 1 month late. So the November deadline for the RO1, the K, and the RO3 and the R21. 1 month after the deadline for new applications. So this is, you got the grant initially, let's say for 5 years, and then you're going to resubmit your RO1, or let's say you didn't get funded the first time on your K application, and you're going to submit an amended or resubmission application 1 month later from the usual deadline. For those that are AIDS or AIDS-related applications, you have your own deadline. So what is the sort of sequence of events after you submit an application? So let's look at cycle 3. So you just submitted an application and usually in the October, November deadlines that we discussed. It's 3 months until the grant is reviewed, around 3 months, let me say. The grant is reviewed. 3 months later until the advisory council of that particular institute, let's say the Cancer Institute, looks at all the scores and makes a decision, yes or no, whether they're going to fund it, and another 3 months until NIH issues the award notice. So it's about a 9-month process with three-month steps. So submitting in for the October, November deadlines, maybe you'll get an award by the beginning of July. So what does the application process look like? This is a very old picture that I had, black and white, from a hard copy booklet that NIH had issued many years ago, but I think it lays things out very clearly. Investigators come together, they submit an application, and it goes to the NIH, and it'll go specifically to the Center for Scientific Review, where they will, in the old days, let's say, open the FedEx box, look at the application, and they'll make 2 decisions. One is what study section will review the grant and what institute will fund the grant when it gets a wonderful score. So it is critical that your grant end up in the right study section or review group. NIH now has a form which can be included in the application where you can specifically ask for a specific study section. So one should research the different study sections and then complete that form, even though it's optional. I strongly encourage everybody to research the different study sections, their areas of research that are under their purview, and then complete that form and submit with the application. It's an administrative form. It's not seen by the grant reviewers. It's only seen by the administrators. But even if you've completed a wonderful and very strong grant with exciting science, it needs to go to the right study section where individuals have the appropriate expertise and can understand how exciting proposal you've put together. If it goes to the wrong study section where the reviewers don't have the right areas of expertise, you won't get as informed a review as possible. And you can also request a specific institute. That's usually fairly straightforward. Eye Institute, Cancer Institute, and so forth. So after the review is done at the Center for Scientific Review, the Center for Scientific Review then sends the grant to all the different institutes, which will then fund the grant. And just as a reminder, in most cases, the research grants are reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review. Most fellowships are reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review. The Ks, the Career Development Grants, are reviewed at the Institute, and the RFAs are reviewed at the Institute because they're the ones that have put up the money. And so NIH will say that they have a dual review system. One is that initial review where you will get a score, which we will go through at the study section at the scientific review group. And then it'll go to the Institute's council to look at the scores from the study sections and to make the final decision on whether the grant should get funded. In the vast majority of cases, the Institute will follow what the study section says. And so this is a newer slide, which is a little bit more complicated, but I think it's also informative, so I'll go through it a little bit. So you submit an R01 grant that goes to the Center for Scientific Review. They assign it to its study section. It's reviewed at the study section. It gets a score, and then it goes to the Institute's council. It gets a great score, a fundable score, and then the Institute, in this case, Allergy and Infectious Disease, makes an award. The other neat thing about NIH is that after the grant ends, you can submit a competing renewal, another grant building on what you've already learned in the first grant. let's say after it went to the study section, it didn't get such a great score, and so it wasn't funded. You get all of the comments back from the reviewers. You respond very strongly to all of the reviewers' comments. And the neat thing about NIH is that you then submit a revised application, an amended application. And then it will go back to the same study section, and the reviewers will read this new grant, and they will also look at how well you responded to the reviewers' comments the first time. They won't have the initial application, but they will have the comments from the initial application. And so part of their determination on whether to fund the second application is how well you responded to the first application. So just to give you an idea, everybody likes to see numbers. So tremendous amount of information on NIH's webpage. But just to show you this, the difference between, here's the success rate of the first application, 15.1%, and those grants that didn't get funded and they submitted an amended application, the A1, the first amended application, the success rate there, as you can see, it's over twice what the initial application is. And continuing, suppose you, after your first 4 or 5 years, you submit a competing renewal, the success rate right there is quite high. It's 41.7. So this is all of NIH together. It's not specific for a particular institute, but you can see the different rates here. Let's say you were responding to an RFA, and as I mentioned, the grant is not reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review. It's reviewed at the institute, in this case, Allergy and Infectious Disease. It's reviewed by Allergy and Infectious Disease. The council agrees with what the study section says. It was fundable, which was wonderful. You get funded. But it wasn't funded the first time. So that's a bit problematic, because many times RFAs might not be reissued, or they might be issued once every 5 years. So now, even if you don't get funded the first time with an RFA, you might be able to go back, change things around a little bit, and submit it as a regular R01, even though you didn't get funded in response to the RFA. Here's your reviewers. Okay, and so what are the scores? The scores are 1 to 9, whole integers, though basically to get funded, you need to get, I would say, 1, 2, or 3. And that on the right-hand side is sort of a very qualitative description of what each of these numbers mean. And the scores, you will get what's called an overall impact score, which is the average of the impact scores offered by everybody at the study section. And what I've copied here is the review criteria from that sort of generic parent R01 that I discussed earlier in today's presentation. And basically, what are they looking for? Grants for which there's a likelihood of the project to exert a sustained and powerful influence on the particular research field that's being addressed, a major scientific impact. There are 5 main and core research criteria. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but A, significance of the project that you're discussing. Why is it important? The investigative team, so it's you and your collaborators, co-investigators, demonstrating that what you're proposing is innovative, and the approach. How are you going to answer the question? So you talk about the significance, you talk about what questions you want to answer. So the approach is your methodology, if you will, and this is where you would include preliminary data or pilot data demonstrating the feasibility of what you're proposing. And then your research environment, demonstrating that you have the right core facilities or patient population or whatever you need to do the research. And the reviewers will address each of these 5 areas in bullet points, the strengths and weaknesses. If you don't get funded the first time, it is these weaknesses that you need to address in the amended application, the second resubmission that goes in. I just want to highlight some other additional review criteria. Something that has just changed in NIH applications is if you're doing research with human subjects, it used to be women, minorities, and children. It's now women, minorities, and individuals across the lifespan. And as I mentioned, if you're resubmitting an application that wasn't funded the first time, you need to very strongly respond to the previous reviewer's comments. Similarly, a relatively new area that's now being addressed, especially for those doing bench research, authenticating key biological chemical resources. So for instance, antibodies, demonstrating that, you know, they have the activity that you're describing. And then also the budget and period of support, as this is especially true for new investigators, demonstrating that you have enough money to do what you say you're going to do and enough time. There's tremendous emphasis recently on rigor and reproducibility, so I want to bring up these 4 areas that NIH and the reviewers are looking for. The rigor of the prior research that you're building upon, that you're presenting a rigorous experimental design, power analysis, how many animals are in the study, how many human subjects, how the data is going to be analyzed, the consideration of biological variables, sex as a biological variable, and the key biological or chemical resources that we discussed. I want to very quickly touch on non-government agencies, nonprofit, non-government agencies, and this gives you an idea of some data from the Health Research Alliance, which is 46 organizations. This is their data from 2012, 2014, and how they spend their money. The private foundations, much more in terms of basic research. Those that get their money from the public, you can see it's much more disease oriented, because I think they probably use it as a way of raising funds. And how do they then distribute their funds? And I want to highlight that a lot of their funding goes towards career development and training. So they put a lot of their money in supporting students, in postdocs, and junior faculty, trying to keep individuals on the career path towards being academic scientists. So don't forget, even though we sort of focused on NIH and government agencies, don't forget the non-government agencies, which I would sort of group them into 3 areas in terms of the nonprofit world. Voluntary health organizations like the American Cancer Society, professional societies, your own, the Infectious Disease Society of America as an example, private foundations, such as the Doris Duke Foundation as examples. And here's an example of some K awards, which they might call scholar awards or career development awards, funded by different types of these non-government, nonprofit agencies. And I wanted to highlight the fact that the Harold Amos program also has a number of programs, and they've partnered with some professional societies to fund junior physicians, dentists, and nurses in these different areas. All right, so how to find out about funding, okay? How to find out about appropriate funding agencies and funding mechanisms. And I would say talk to people, all right? Talk to colleagues, network. Look at the acknowledgement section in journal articles. You'll see the NIH grants listed, but you'll see other funding agencies. When you go to scientific talks, the last slide, folks will thank the different agencies or companies or whatever that funded their research. Here's an email that I got from the Department of Defense program telling me that I should connect with them on social media, and I would suggest that you do that if, let's say you do cardiovascular research. Well, the American Heart Association would be your agency to always stay connected to, if you will. The NIH guide comes out every week, listing notices and funding funding opportunities. But you can also do all sorts of different searches of the funding announcements, clinical trials, not clinical trials, the different funding mechanisms. You can limit it by different institutes. And so this is an example of one of the searches that I did. Let's say I was interested diabetes, any funding funding announcement. I wasn't interested in a clinical trial. I just wanted those that were from the Aging Institute, and I only wanted RO1s. So I was very specific. Of course, I would save this search. I would stick in my email address, and then I would get email alerts from the NIH guide whenever there was a new funding mechanism that met my search criteria. And you can have, of course, many saved searches. So there's no reason not to know when NIH issues a funding announcement that's in your specific area of interest. Many universities also buy access to commercial databases. Just to show you that Pivot is one of, I'm not promoting Pivot specifically, but I'm just saying that if your university has one of these commercial funding databases, I suggest that you use it, find out what's in the database, and then similarly, you can save your search, all right, and then get email alerts whenever they have added a funding opportunity that meets your search criteria. For those whose research might be more appropriate for the foundation world, there's the Foundation Center now under Candide. They have a online directory where one can search all of these different foundations with keywords and so forth, and find out all about their giving history, what grants they've given, who they've given grants to, and so forth. So this is another way of finding out about funding opportunities. And my strong suggestion is that when you find out about a program that's specifically of interest to you, create a calendar of one of these deadlines, because you don't want to miss any of these deadlines. Many of these programs only have one deadline a year. A lot of them seem to be in the fall, unlike NIH that has 3 deadlines a year. So you don't want to miss it and have to wait another year, or it's quite possible that you wouldn't be eligible after another year. So create a calendar so you can keep track of when these deadlines are coming up. Support for new investigators. So NIH has these a bit slides have a little bit of old data at the beginning, but you'll see the point. NIH has noticed that over time, the age of individuals getting their first RO1 grant has crept up over time. 1980, 2006, 2020. And they've been looked at the data with a lot of specificity in terms of the degree training of the individual, MD, PhD, MD, PhD only. And this is a very steep incline over time of the age of the first RO1 equivalent grant. This is a quote from Sally Rockey, who was deputy director of NIH at that point. From 1980 to 2001, the average age increased nearly 0.3 years per year, and it leveled off. And then this grant, which was the age of the principal investigator, age 36 and younger versus 66 and older. And so you can see the aging of the biomedical workforce over here. Even made it into the New York Times as an editorial. The median age of first-time recipients of RO1 grants was 42. That's what I showed you in one slide. And more people over 65 are funded with research grants than under the age of 35. That was the second grant. So one of the ways that NIH responded was to classify individuals and offer the classification of what's called ESI, or early stage investigator status. And this is somebody who does not have an RO1, has not had an RO1, and is within 10 years of their PhD or 10 years of completing medical residency. You can get an extension for these 10 years, if many people do. Military service, clinical training, the clinical years of fellowship, family, care responsibilities, having a child. and so forth. And so many people will get this 10-year extended. And the whole point is to give you a special status as an early stage investigator. Having a K grant does not make you ineligible. Having an NIH loan repayment does not make you ineligible, or one of these smaller R03 or R21 grants. Anybody who meets this classification should definitely fill out the form so that you are classified as an ESI, or early stage investigator. And to give you an example of the impact, this is heart, lung, and blood's pay line for the R01 for the established investigators, which is at the 16th percentile, and the early stage investigators are at the 26th percentile, a very different funding pay line. So if one meets the criteria for early stage investigator, one should definitely fill out the information so you are classified as an early stage investigator. And the whole point here is to have the funding rate for early stage investigators be the same as its established investigators. So have those two lines, if you will, as close together. Lots of white papers, lots of reports on supporting the biomedical workforce. NIH has recently issued what they would call the Next Generation Researchers Initiative to develop, modify, prioritize policies, promote opportunities for new researchers and early research independence, increase opportunities for new researchers to receive funding, enhance training and mentorship programs for researchers, and enhance workforce diversity, and create a sustainable workforce across all career stages. This is their stated policy. All right, so the final section is sort of general comments on how to put together, develop a competitive application. So the first is, before you start writing, prepare to complete the application. Think about what will make the application more competitive. Speak with the NIH program officer. Speak with individuals and colleagues who received grants from this funding agency. Ask to see their application, a funded application. It's always helpful to see what a successful application looks like. Review the agency's review criteria, very important, so that when you write the grant, you're thinking about what the reviewers have been told to take into consideration, and you can address all of those points. Review the agency's review process. As I discussed, make sure your grant ends up in the right study section. Think about what will make the application more competitive. Should you bring on a co-investigator? Excuse me for a second. What colleagues have areas of expertise that you don't have that will make the application stronger? Do you have access to all of the necessary research resources, the special animal strain, the core facility, the special piece of equipment, and you want to demonstrate that in the application? What preliminary data or pilot data or preliminary experiments can you do that will strengthen the application and demonstrate feasibility? And maybe you shouldn't go in for the next deadline. Maybe you should wait for the deadline after that, because the application will be so much stronger because you'll have better and more rigorous preliminary work or pilot data. And the K applications and fellowship applications include confidential letters of reference. We'll begin to think about who should write those letters of reference. You don't want to give them a 1-week warning right before deadline to ask them to write these important confidential letters of reference. So maybe there should be more than one principal investigator, you and a colleague. Now, having said that, let me tell you that unless you are both ESIs, you will not get that special pay line. But bring them on then as a collaborator or a co-investigator. Even if they don't work at the same institution as you, they can still be involved in the grant. And basically what would happen is there would be a subcontract from your institution to their institution where you would send money, if you will, to support the research component that they're contributing to your research grant. Try to make the research as multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary as possible. And then if it's a K grant, maybe you should have a co-mentor or set up an advisory committee and not just have a single mentor. But these are all things that you should think about in terms of making the application more competitive before you begin to write. All right, begin to meet with all of those individuals that are going to be involved in your application. Think about the core facilities. Meet with the research administrators in your unit that are going to help you with the budget or other details. Are there any regulatory issues involved? Know about them before you begin to write. For instance, research with human subjects or laboratory animals. Or if there's an institution in another country involved, there's another administrative requirement that has to be met. All these things are doable and possible. That's why I say meet with the research administrators at your institution. But you don't want to be dealing with them with a deadline hanging over your head. It's at this point now that you can begin to read the and begin to work on the application. Read the instructions, okay, and read them over again. Identify all the different components of the application. Create a checklist for each of these different components and a sequence of when you're going to complete them, not a list, because maybe you need to do this one component first and then you can work on another component. So you can't do the second component until you complete the first component. Create an outline. And the outline is not only a list of everything that you want to cover, but also how long each section should be. Because all of these different components have page limitations. So this you could cover in 3 sentences, this is 2 paragraphs, and so forth. And you want to have an idea of how long everything is before you begin to write. If you have to cut, it takes a very long time. You're so wedded to the text. It will take you, let's say, a weekend to write 2 pages, all right, and 2 weeks to cut a page, if you will. And think about who's going to write all of the different sections. Maybe the biostatistician will write that section, or the person who's an expert in imaging, and so forth. You'll have letters of collaboration, letters of support, let's say, from the facility director saying that you can use the facility. I would say that none of these folks are going to write the letters, and you would prepare drafts for them. And then the letters can say what you want them to say since you've completed the draft. Here's an example of somebody who didn't read all of the instructions. This was from a fellowship application where the bio-sketch, which is required, did not meet the required format. And NIH has the authority not to review the grant, to pull the grant, and it won't even get to the study section. Thank goodness in this case they did not do that. It was reviewed, the student got the grant. Okay, but make sure you're going to be getting bio sketches from other individuals. Make sure that they meet the NIH format. So just to highlight all the different topics that I just discussed. Make sure you know the page limit for every component. Maybe you're going to start meeting with people. Well, set up the schedule for these meetings at the very beginning. Maybe at the beginning you meet every 3 weeks, and then every 2 weeks, and then every week as you get closer to the deadline. Even these sort of boring things about what font should we use, and how are you going to name the files of all the different versions, seems kind of trivial. But if you're using different fonts, and let's say you put everything together at the end, you could be over the page limitation. And make sure everybody understands what their timeline is and their milestones are for completing their sections of the grant. All right, read the instructions. I can't highlight that too much. Never assume that the reviewers know what you mean. If you want them to know something, say it. If it's important in more than one section, tell it to them in more than one section. Don't infer. Tell them. Refer to the literature thoroughly and thoughtfully. Not supposed to be a review article, but you want them to know that you know exactly where the field is and how your research is moving it forward. The hypothesis of my study is, don't bury the lead. This is the rationale of the whole application. So clearly stated, okay? If you discuss challenges or limitations, it shows a certain maturity of a new investigator because you've looked at what you're proposing very critically. Now, having recognized that there are limitations or challenges, then discuss alternate approaches. We don't expect to say C, A, B, and C, but if we do, this is how we're going to address by doing X, Y, and Z, if you will. It shows a lot of maturity on the part of an investigator that critically reviews what they're doing. Okay, include tables and figures. I'm going to get to that. If you use an outline and follow it, though you might modify it as you go along, the application will read as an organized text. Okay. Ask your friends to read the application and offer comments. Don't do it the Friday afternoon before the deadline. You want to give them time to give you a good review, and then time for you then to implement changes as per their comments. And think about the application from the perspective of the reviewer. They haven't seen it before. Make sure that the application follows in the correct order. In terms of well-designed tables and figures, here's some suggestions. Include a little caption with the figure so they understand what the figure means. Without having to read the text. Don't make it too complicated. You could see if there's 5 panels and 12 lines in each panel, it's almost too much for them to get what you're trying to say. They might not print the application, and if they print it, they might not print it in color. Make it easy for the reviewers to read. Don't make any text in the figure too small. And so, for instance, suggestions are to have the figure on the same page as the text that references it, so that they don't have to turn the page or they don't have to scroll. And then in the text, write figure 4 in bold so their eye can move very quickly from figure to relevant text. And what I mean by C application for a reviewer's perspective, realizing the order that the different components are when the application is put together. So for instance, somebody was describing themselves, I'll give you an example, and didn't mention some papers that they got published. And I brought that to their attention. They said, well, it's in my biosketch. I said, well, your biosketch is 35 pages later. They haven't read your biosketch yet. So realize how the reviewers are reading the grant. Maybe include a timeline like this. This is an example of a 3-year grant, demonstrating to the reviewers that you've thought through that everything that you're proposing is doable in the time frame that you have. So if it was a 5-year grant, you would do something like this for 5 years. And it shows that you've thought things through to this level of specificity. You want to look at these points and be able to say yes about your application, and think about every question that they can have and put the answer in the application, because you are not going to be at the study section and you don't want them to have any lingering unanswered questions. Don't do the minimum. Optional doesn't mean don't do. So this assignment request form where you can request a specific study section, it's optional, but I strongly suggest that individuals include that with an application. If you're doing research with human subjects, there's a part where you put in the structure of the study team. Well, it's only required for those that are doing clinical trials, but anybody else can also do it. So why not do it? It shows that you've thought about the different members of the study team, their responsibility, and how you're leading the team. If you will, it's an area for you to add. There's no page limitation here, so it's an area for you to be able to add extra and important information. Okay. Try to fill all of the pages when you have it. So here was an example from a K award, and somebody only filled in half the page to talk about their institution and what a great place it was to be a junior investigator. what I would say, avoid the 3Ds, the day of deadline drama, where you realize in the day of the deadline you're missing a required component, or you're missing a component that's not required, but it would make the application more competitive. Or you just realize the research involves human subjects. And this happens a lot with basic scientists that are doing research, genetic studies, or research with human tissue, and realize that maybe they meet the formal definition of doing research with human subjects. Or there's some other research compliance issue. There's a problem with the budget. It doesn't add up now. You're missing a signature. Somebody's away on vacation, or there's some formatting problem. You're over on the margins or something like that. In the grants office, somebody's biosketch is not going to submit the grant. Try to avoid these areas. If you look at this as an example of a grant that was submitted at exactly 5 p.m. without a minute to spare from the deadline. Lots of drama. Try to avoid this. I sort of like this slide for fellowships and K applications, where there's sort of two parts. Not everything that can be counted counts. And this is sort of the quantitative section of the research section of the application, where you and your mentor talk about what data should be included in the application. And then there's sort of the qualitative section of the application, of the K award, of the fellowship, where you talk about yourself and your career goals, your commitment to doing research, and your previous research experiences. As an investigator, this is how you want to come across. So when you write the personal statement or the candidate section for a K award, think about and you discuss your previous research experiences. Focus on the intellectual aspects, what you learned scientifically, what the findings were, whether you got any papers published or any presentations that you gave, any awards that you received. Don't focus on the technical aspects. Everybody does this. You learned this skill set and learned how to this assay, and you learned how to grow cells this way and so forth. Instead, focus on the intellectual aspects. You learned about study design. You learned about asking critical and important scientific questions and designing a hypothesis-driven study. These are the kinds of things that you want to focus on. Sometimes there's problems with a mentor. When to bring on, let's say, a co-mentor. Your mentor is too busy with other responsibilities, already mentoring too many people. They don't have experience being a mentor. They're too junior. They don't have sufficient funds to support your research. This is when you would bring in a co-mentor. Or it's not the right institution for you. They don't have the technical resources, that piece of specialized equipment that you need, or career development programming that you need. So besides funding, role models are important, mentors are important, colleagues in your area are mentored. Be open to new ideas and challenges, take advantage of unique opportunities, and networking. By accident, I mean, you meet somebody at a conference or you're in the elevator with them. Take advantage of all of these unique opportunities. And many of you are by joining today's webinar, and I'm thankful that you are. Common problems with applications, the final slides now, with grant applications from new investigators. Doesn't address the funding agency's specific mission or their instructions or the amount of money that's available, okay? Overly ambitious everywhere in terms of how much money is available and in terms of how much time the grant is for, the expertise available. Career level, it should be for a more established investigator, the research resources available. These sort of go together. It's a fishing expedition. You're going to run a bunch of gels and look for a dot on one and no dot on the other and figure out why there's a dot. Well, that's not a hypothesis-driven set of experiments, or it's too descriptive. You're collecting data without looking at the mechanism behind what's going on. I would say every application is strengthened by having as much preliminary data as possible. It demonstrates the feasibility of the project, and it also demonstrates that you can do the project. Okay. Common problems. These are areas that NIH is very interested in. The study design, what are the control groups? Okay, it's unfocused. It's, let's say, all about diabetes, but not in a very focused way. Power analysis, the statistics aspects, how the data is going to be analyzed. Okay, you don't demonstrate to them that you have the necessary research resources. Get a letter from the director of the core facility. Get a letter of the person that is sending you that specialized cell line, or the physician that's giving you the patient samples or whatever. The budget has to match what you're proposing. The methodologies are beyond the expertise of the research team. So bring on somebody, a co-investigator has the right expertise. And this, of course, is very important for this group. As a new investigator starting out on your own, you need to demonstrate that you're independent of your previous mentor and that you can run this new research program. I was once a review administrator at NIH at the time when applications were not electronic, and I asked to see what the mailroom looked like. And the mailroom was a pile, the world's biggest copying machines, and piles of FedEx boxes. So think about that your application is one of the applications here. In fact, it's back there. And your application is in competition with all these other applications and has to make it stand out. So think about the reviewers sitting at that study section, and they, in fact, have lots of grants to review on top of everything else and all their other responsibilities, right? These are peer reviewers these are not NIH administrators who are reviewing these grants. These are faculty and investigators from all across the country, and they are reviewing lots of grants. So, you know, there's some grants that will probably definitely get funded and some unfortunately not. And the vast majority of the grants are in the middle, and they're all basically fine, but there isn't enough money to support all of the fine grants. And so basically, what do the reviewers do? They take all these fine grants and they line them up and they try to differentiate between them. So some, let's say, don't have good statistics, bad power analysis. So those applications go. Or some didn't demonstrate they have access to the necessary core facilities or other research resources. Those go. Or those that are for K awards, they spent all the time on the research aspect and not on the career development aspect of the application. So those go. And then this sort of seems kind of trivial, but the figures were so small, or the tables were so small, the reviewers really couldn't make out all the exciting data that was presented just because it was too small. So those go. And in the end, okay, you want to be one of the last applications standing, if you will, because they couldn't find anything wrong with your application. It was exciting research, proposing to use exciting methodologies and exciting findings, and you were able to correctly represent all that in your proposal. And finally, good luck. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Dr. Rubin. And I think we're going to transition to our Q&A portion.
Okay,
So,
that's great. That's great.
yeah.
I'm just going to take a little bit of water, if you don't mind, before we start this part. Okay.
No.
And I'm happy to answer everybody's questions and stay here till all the questions are answered. So thank you all for your patience.
Great. Thank you so much for your expertise. All righty, here we go. So, hello, I'm a PhD student going to defend my thesis soon. So,
Congratulations.
Is there any NIH awards I can apply to?
So there is the NIH Fellowship, and the F32 is the F32 is the individual postdoc fellowship. But you should also look, when you begin to look for your postdoc position, see if they have a training grant in your area, because the training grant is sort of a group of F32s, if you will, and it's an award made to the institution where the institution fills the slot. So ask if you could be one of the individuals supported by their training grant, which is a T32.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Next question. Will you clarify the different types of research, i.e.
Okay.
intramural research? And I think you touched on this.
Okay, so what I meant by intramural research is that, you know, there is a building of a National Cancer Institute where there are individuals that are government employees, postdocs and investigators and PIs and so forth that conduct research on site at the NIH. Bethesda, Maryland is one of the largest sites. And that's what's meant by intramural research. It's done at NIH. And extramural research is the money that they send out across the country to support all these grants that we discussed today.
Great. Okay, so next question. Are there circumstances when you would recommend K01 instead of a K99ROO, assuming you're eligible for both?
So that's a very good question. So one thing is a K99R00, there is no citizenship requirement. The K01 one needs to be a US citizen or a permanent resident. I think it depends upon how much more mentoring you think you need or how much time you need before you could be an independent investigator. A K01 is usually up to 5 years. The mentored part of the K99R00 is 2 years. The K99 is part is 2 years. I think if you have a very significant paper with your mentor and you think you would be a competitive candidate for the K99R00, then go for that, just because when you begin to look for a job and you have an R00, that's a very powerful position to be in, to have an R00. But it's a decision that you have to make in terms of how many years do you think you are away from being an independent investigator? Do you have a strong publication in your current position with your mentor? So that's a very good question.
Great. Okay, so is there a time limitation for when you must receive a K award by? I recently heard that you had to be awarded a K01 within 7 years of receiving your PhD. I can't find anything to back this up. I wanted to check into this as I did a long postdoc, 5 years, and am in my 2nd year as an assistant professor.
So that's a good question. So one of the things, if you notice from my slides, the different institutes use the K01 funding mechanism for different purposes. So my suggestion is to look at the K01 program from your particular institute and look at their guidelines. I don't think I could give a general response to anything related to a K01, since the different institutes, I sort of use it as, I call it the miscellaneous K. The different institutes use it, as you saw, for different purposes. So I would look at the K01 announcement specifically for your institute. And also there is a program, at least one program officer at your institute responsible for the K01 program. Give them a call and ask them. Maybe you have special, maybe they do have a time limit, but maybe you personally have special circumstances to extend that timeline.
Great advice.
Thank you.
Okay, so will the PhD be eligible for the K23 application?
So you have to look at the details, but I generally think maybe a PhD, let's say in clinical psychology or something like that, who has a clinical background. But in most of the cases, it's for a clinician. But each institute, similarly for the K23, there's a program officer at your institute. Generally, it's for clinically trained individuals, but I would speak with the program officer just to confirm your eligibility. If you looked at one of my slides, the first thing I said was talk to the agency's program officer.
Yes. Okay. So as a new investigator, what are some of the factors that determine if one should apply for an R21 versus an R01?
So it's not only as a new investigator, as any investigator. With one caveat, it depends upon what you're proposing. An R01 can be for 5 years, could be for, let's say, $250,000 or $300,000 in direct costs. An R21 in the vast majority of cases is only for 275,000, only over 2 years. So that can determine what project you can propose. And clearly they're very overlapping in terms of time and money. They're very not overlapping in terms of money and time time. Having said that, it's my understanding that the institutes do not have separate pay lines for the R21 and the R03 for established investigators versus ESIs or early stage investigators. So that two different pay lines that I showed you for new investigator versus established investigator was for R01. I don't believe that they do that for the R21, because the point of that is to give you a leg up, if you will, for the R01. That is the goal in all of these career development and supportive policies, is to get folks to have an R01.
Got it. Alrighty. So is there a time limit to submit a K award, a post-PhD within 10 years? And I think we had
I think I sort of addressed that. The one that's the hard deadline is the K99, which was for 4 years. But I would say talk to your institute. I think that. All right, next one. Yes, contracts and U's, which are cooperative agreements, they definitely pay for salary, they pay for fringe, they pay for the research costs of doing that project. They pay for whatever research personnel are necessary. Absolutely.
Great to know. Is it true that all K99s go to one study section?
No, the Ks go to that institute's K study section. So the Eye Institute will have a case study section, and Cancer will have a case study section, and so forth.
Wonderful. Is there a specific program Dr. Rubin can suggest to learn the different components of the R and a workshop one could attend? Where does this take place? We do not have these resources at my university, specifically on the K award.
So I teach a course at Columbia on these topics. I have all my slides on my course webpage, and you have the URL at the bottom of all my slides. It's really very easy. It's grantscourse.columbia.edu. Grants course is one word, and you're welcome to look at any of those slides. But maybe something for Alexis and I to think about for the future.
Absolutely. Alrighty. So is it mandatory to submit a revised version, i.e. reviewed by a study section, the immediate next grant cycle, or can you wait a little longer to complete the revisions?
You absolutely can wait, and you should wait. I think it's about 3 years. You can't go over 3 years. If you submit after 3 years, then it's just a new grant. But if you want to submit it as a resubmission, they don't use the word revision, it's a little complicated, but an amended application, it depends upon what the reviewers want. Maybe the reviewers want you to do more experiments, and it'll take you 6 months to do the extra experiment. So you should absolutely wait until you can address all of the reviewers' comments. I think after 3 years, it's not considered an amended application anymore. But the important thing is to aggressively address all of the reviewers' comments.
Wonderful. Will the K awards be considered for applicants who earn their PhD at the same institution?
I think so. I don't see why, no.
Okay. For ESL, can extension be given for teaching?
I think it's ESI. Early stage investigator. I would, there is one request extension through saying that you weren't doing research during that time. I would fill out a request for the extension. And I know somebody whose request for extension was rejected and then asked for a re-review, provided additional information and asked for a re-review and then got it the second time. So definitely put in a request.
Great. Can you say more about how a K, such as K01, would work for someone in a junior faculty / instructor position mentored research, but not in a full-time postdoc. Can the mentor be at a different institution?
So let me take the last thing first. So the mentor can technically be at a different institution, but I don't usually recommend it. I mean, unless they're like sister institutions right next to each other. The mentor-mentee relationship is supposed to be, you know, a very special relationship, and the mentor is always available and can always walk into her or his office and ask a question. So the reviewers are going to look at the availability of the mentor and the nature of that relationship. And I'm not, I mean, I think one needs to be sort of full-time to have to have a K. Some Ks are for junior faculty, instructor, assistant professor, and some Ks are for senior postdocs. I hope that answers the question.
I believe it did. She said thank you. So.
Oh, she did. Well, thank you. Okay, good.
Okay, so we had a couple of questions that came in after our presentation,
Okay.
but let's address those now.
Okay.
Alrighty, folks. So apology for the different format. However, we want to make sure we address all your questions. So,
sure.
Does one have to have existing relationship, a paper together to recruit a mentor for a K award?
So, I mean, one can submit a K award with, you know, sort of anybody as a mentor, but it helps to have an existing relationship. It helps to have data together. It helps to present together, if not a paper together, because you can say, look how successful this mentee-mentor relationship is. We've done this work together. Isn't this exciting? Please fund this grant, if you will, so we can continue this successful relationship. As opposed to, well, we haven't done anything together too much. We don't really know each other that well, but trust us, we'll work it out. But it would be a much stronger application if you've already, you know, have an ongoing and somewhat successful project together.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. Thank you, Dr. Rubin, for your excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for the
comment. It would be really great to do another session just for the R15 grants.
You know, the R15, why don't you contact me offline? The R15 is really a very specific funding mechanism. So please feel free to contact me offline, and we can discuss the R15, which is a very specific funding program.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. Okay, next question. Hello. As a very new assistant professor, started 4 months ago, I'm preparing a K award application. However, I yet don't have preliminary data that has come out of my own lab. Can I use my previous publication results that are related as preliminary data?
Well, I mean, your preliminary work, your preliminary papers, and so forth are all sort of discuss, you know, your past productivity, which the reviewers will think about it in terms of, you know, the expectation for continued successful productivity. But I think they just want to have a general feeling that the current project is working and you have all the resources in place and it's ongoing and there's some successful, some exciting preliminary data. And so they have an idea of what track you're on.
Great. Alrighty, next question. Will you qualify the 75% for K grants? I thought I read that NIH defines this as 100% of a 9-month contract. Is that correct?
Well, they require 75, a lot of individuals with K, let's say the K08 and the K23, also have clinical responsibilities. Some people have teaching responsibilities. So they require 75% of your professional time. There are some exceptions that some of the institutes make for surgeons, realizing that or heart, lung, and blood for procedure-based cardiologists allow that to go to 50%. As a general rule, it's 75%. When you get your own R01 in the last 2 years of your K, you can also reduce it to 50%.
Good to know. Yes, and here's another additional anonymous attendee who is also requesting additional information surrounding the R15.
Okay.
Would it be appropriate for them to send you an email?
Sure.
Okay,
Sure.
great. Alrighty. Next question. Hello, I'm currently in limbo without an institution and I want to apply for a K-99 grant. Do you have to be affiliated with a school to apply, or what do you suggest if your investigator ran out of funds?
Well, that's a tough one. So these awards, these grants are not made to individuals. These grants are made to institutions. And then they set up an account, if you will, and the principal investigator would say, pay so-and-so, charge against the grant. Buy these reagents. I'm going to a meeting to present the results, charge the grant. It would be good to one needs to sort of find a position and find a mentor. That's very tough when the mentor runs out of funding. Try to transfer within your institution.
That's good advice as well. Okay, next question. Could you contact a program officer without the specific aims?
So you can. It depends upon the nature of the question that you have to ask. In terms of eligibility, I don't think you need the specific aims. But if you want to have a little bit more detailed discussion of what you're proposing, wouldn't hurt to have a draft of the specific aims. Having said that, that does not have to be the final version that's submitted with the grant application. No one is checking that it'll match what you sent to the program officer 4 months previously, nor should it. Things can evolve, but it's sort of a starting point if you're going to have a programmatic conversation. If you're going to have a question about eligibility, I don't think you need specific aims, in terms of this many years out or that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Next question. I am in year 5 of my K01 and looking to apply for my first R01. I've heard some senior investigators state that they do not feel K awardees are ready for an R01. Do you have any tips on how I could demonstrate or emphasize how the K has prepared me for an R01?
I would say publications, demonstrating productivity over the previous 5-year research experience, and then what you're proposing, building on those results.
Absolutely. Just to clarify, if you did 1 year postdoc and now you're an instructor, do you still qualify for a K99/R00?
Well, the titles, instructor or associate research scientist, mean different things at different institutions. They don't all mean the same thing at every institution. The point, and I think, excuse me, if you look at the guidelines from NIH, they even bring that up, especially folks with clinical responsibilities. My suggestion is to call the program officer. I think the point is that you're, close to being, whether you're still in a mentored position or not. And if they think that you're not eligible for the K99R00, then I would suggest applying for a K01 or a K08 or a K23.
Gotcha.
The folks are asking a lot of sort of eligibility questions, and you're not alone. Everybody has these types of questions. And NIH is always issuing clarifications also.
Is there a good resource webpage that we can direct users surrounding these sort of eligibility questions? Vary for each grant.
Yeah, well, so within each K award funding announcement, and you have the web page. Within each funding announcement, the K09, the K01, and so forth, there's a link to institute, another web page that has institute-specific guidelines and institute-specific program officers to contact.
That's great. Okay, I'm interested in the effective medical mentoring programs on the long-term healthcare degree and career choice. Which grant funding agent is the most appropriate to explore for potential funding? A foundation grant or NIH agency?
So I'm not familiar with this specific program, but I don't think it's as a general comment, I don't think it's an either or kind of thing. One can apply for foundation funding at the same time as applying for NIH. So I don't think it's an either or kind of thing.
Gotcha.
I would, talk to people in your particular field of research or activity, see where they get funded, look up their papers, look in the acknowledgement section of their papers, see what's funding their work. That last slide when you go to presentations, see where they're being funded.
That's great advice. So for K-25 awards, do all the mentors, not the main mentor, need to hold major NIH awards?
So, okay, so the K-25, this is the one that brings folks from quantitative backgrounds into biomedical research. Is that what they're thinking about? But just generally speaking, the mentors have to have extramural peer-reviewed funding, because you'll see that with all of these K applications, they provide predominantly salary support and fringe benefit support for you, and limited support for research costs. So the expectation is that the mentor, and that's one of the questions that's asked in the grant, that the mentor will have funding to pay for your research, because how else will you get the research done? So it could be NIH funding, it could be Department of Defense, but there has to be funding to support your research. And also the mentor is also thought to be a role model. So the goal of having a K is to transition to having an R01. So it would be good if the mentor was also R01 funded, because they're trying, their job is also to have you transition to the stage of being an independent investigator.
Great. So more K questions. Can you propose to use data from an institution different than your current location where you have research collaborators, i.e. where you did your PhD or postdoc training?
Well, you just have to show maybe, maybe it's access to a database or something like that, that you have a letter from whoever's in charge of that database saying that you'll have access.
And this kind of is a secondary component of that question. So the R21 or K01 requirement for postdocs to have a letter of intent from your institution to be granted assistant professor at the time of receiving the grant. Well, what if I can't get one? Can I apply as a postdoc without any letter to change my academic status?
Well, one doesn't need to have the appropriate title at the time of the application, but one needs to have the appropriate title at the time of award. And it's quite possible that your institution won't send out the application if they haven't been, it hasn't been confirmed from your department or wherever that you'll have the appropriate title at the time of award, because they're in effect signing off that everything in the application is appropriate.
Understood. Next question. Are you awardees ineligible for ESI?
What kind of awardees?
You awardees?
Well, I have to look that up, but I think if it's sort of an equivalent to an R01, the answer is probably no. But would have to look up the specifics. That is not, let me just clarify, you are the PI of the grant, then you become ineligible. Not that you're supported on somebody else's grant. Even if you're supported on an R01, but you're not the PI, that does not make you ineligible. It's if you're the PI of the R01 that makes you ineligible.
Gotcha. All righty. Are there any caveats to having a research scientist versus a postdoctoral fellow title when applying to career grants? I'm a PhD candidate looking at postdocs now.
Well, I think you have to meet the eligibility criteria. Can you restate that again?
Yeah. Are there any caveats to having a research scientist title versus a postdoctoral fellow when applying to career grants?
Well, I think it depends upon which career grant, right? So an F-32 is specifically for postdocs. Some of the K-99 and some of the Ks are for senior postdocs. At some institutions, senior postdocs are called associate research scientists or equivalent. So I think NIH, uses the idea as whether you're independent or not. That determines your eligibility. And I think NIH recognizes that different institutes, different academic institutions have different job titles.
Great. And Mitra is taking your advice, so that's wonderful. Also another compliment. Thank you, Dr. Rubin. This has been fantastic and extremely invaluable.
Thank you for all the nice comments.
And a couple more questions. So
yes.
How many first author publications is suggested in the area of your K to be considered as a competitive candidate for K? Essentially, does one need an extensive background of first author publications and in the niche areas of your proposed research for the K?
So, I mean, I always hate to quantitate publications, but in terms of applying as a K, I don't know that you need an application, need a publication in that exact area. I think it's, if you have a good set of preliminary data or pilot data with interesting results, that would make the application more competitive.
Gotcha. Another compliment, thank you for the presentation. It was extremely helpful. Are you able to have multiple grants, in some cases overlapping in nature? So for example, a diversity supplement from an R01, K25, and an R21?
A diversity supplement to a K25?
And an R21.
So, I didn't know that there were diversity supplements to a K25, to tell you the truth. I'd have to double check with that.
R01.
I'm sorry?
A diversity supplement from an R01.
Oh, from an R01.
Yes.
So it's possible. The big deal is that you cannot be over 100% professional effort. So you could maybe have, 50% on a diversity supplement doing one set of specific aims, and 25% on the R21 doing a different set of specific aims. So there's no overlap, and you're not over 100%. That's an example.
Yes. And then we have some questions surrounding K25s. Would it be okay to email you, Dr. Rubin,
Sure.
for some more specific?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah. Okay, sure.
Best option.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, here we go. We got down to two more.
Okay.
So for K99 R00, how can you describe how you will transition to research independence? What are some examples of activities, milestones, outputs that would support that?
Okay, so the R00 part many times is held at a different institution than the K99. But you don't need to know what that institution is or have an offer letter for the R00 when you apply for the K99. They will give you the R00 after you get a job. Now, how do you talk about transitioning to independence and gaining that skill set? Well, you go to all sorts of career leadership programming at your institution, at your professional society. You take this webinar such as learning about grants. So you're gaining all of the skill set, the career development skill set, if you will. You take on more leadership roles as in the K99 part. You bring in different research collaborations into the research group. You go to conferences to present. You become a mentor yourself, mentoring summer students or post-bac students or something like that. So you begin to take on more and more leadership roles, career development-wise and research-wise. And you would build that into the application.
Gotcha. Alrighty, Dr. Rubin, we made it through 45
Okay.
minutes.
Okay.
I just have a couple of housekeeping announcements. So as you guys know, this is a recorded webinar, and will also be housed on the NRMN YouTube channel within the upcoming few weeks. Please do be sure to subscribe so you receive notifications on all of these upcoming career development webinars and wonderful presenters such as Dr. Rubin. Also, for a copy of this presentation, please do send an email request to myself, Alexis Short, alexisshort@unthsc.edu, and we will send you a copy as soon as possible. Also, just a reminder, if you enjoyed this content, please do consider joining the National Research Mentoring Network by signing up as a mentor or mentee. Our mission is to diversify the biomedical research and STEM fields through mentorship, professional development, and networking. And we have a national consortium of over 13,000 mentors and mentees nationwide. So we really encourage you guys to get integrated in our community. And of course, hashtag NRMN mentoring matters, but more so representation matters. So please do join our network. We would love to welcome you. Thank you so much, Dr. Rubin, for sharing this amazing expertise. It's been a great success, and I think some really insightful discoveries were made today. So alrighty, without further ado, take care, everybody, and thank you again, Dr. Rubin.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Alrighty.